but I'm going to go ahead and get started with some additional information. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Truby, and I am a Habitat Conservation Manager with Sky Island Alliance. Today, like I said, I'm joining you from Tucson, Arizona, where the Sky Island Alliance office sits on the traditional lands of the Tohono Pasco Yaqui, and other indigenous people. If you would like to learn more about these lands, my colleague Rick will be pasting into the chat a link for you to learn some more. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by our two speakers. We have Rachel Laura, who is a PhD student and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Species Assessment Team. And we have Candace Fallon, who is a senior endangered species conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, as well as leading the organization's Firefly Atlas, which I'm sure that we will learn more about in a few minutes. Today, our speakers are going to talk about the Southwest spring firefly, what it means to be listed potentially as an endangered species, and how you can get involved. If you're not already connected with our programming, our Spring Seeker program in particular, my colleague Rick will also be posting a link about that into the chat. You can learn more about our Springs program, and I'm really excited to learn more about how the firefly is related to springs in our region. So as a reminder, I'm going to ask that everybody remain muted during the talk, but please feel free to put questions at any point into the chat, and then we'll make sure that we get to those at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Pass it off to Rachel and Candace.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to kick things off once Rachel gets the slides up. But yeah, like Sarah said, my name is Candace. I work with the Xerces Society, and I lead our Firefly conservation program at Xerces. And Rachel's controlling the slides, so I'm going to be asking to move forward. So next slide, please. Thanks. So just quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Xerces Society, we are a science-based nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And so we do this through a variety of ways, whether through applied research, education, outreach, restoration, other collaborations with researchers. And Xerces has 4 main program areas. So we have pollinator conservation, endangered species, which is the program where I work, pesticide reduction, and community engagement. And we've been around since the 1971, so good long time for a nonprofit. Next slide. So I am going to start us off by talking a little bit about firefly life history before diving more into the Southwest spring firefly, which I know you're all excited to learn more about. So this will just be some basic background information. So really basic, what is a firefly? Fireflies are beetles. So they are best known for producing light, and this light may have different purposes. So as juvenile fireflies, the light is really produced as a warning signal to stay away, they are toxic, they taste bad, do not eat me. But as adults, a number of species use light to actually find and attract and communicate with potential mates. And so this is the light that you're probably most familiar with, these flash patterns that we see in the dark. Something that can help you distinguish fireflies from other types of beetles is that they have a head shield. And I don't think I can use my, you probably can't see my pointer, but basically where you see the head, that entire, yep, thanks, Rachel. That entire piece right there is the head shield, and that has some diagnostic features on it that we'll talk about a little bit later as well to help ID specific fireflies. So there are 3 types of fireflies. The flashing fireflies are the ones that probably most folks are familiar with, also known as lightning bugs, particularly out east. We have at least 3 species documented in Arizona and potentially 4. And this is, again, flashing fireflies, they use this light to communicate with each other in courtship. So that is kind of all 3 of these types of fireflies. The differences in many ways are distinguished by their courtship communication. So the second group, glowworms, we have about 8 species in Arizona, and glowworms, while the adult males are winged and fly, they tend to be mostly non-luminescent. There are some exceptions, but primarily do not use light. They have these enormous eyes that just look really wild if you see them up close. And the females are actually flightless. And this photo up here is actually an adult female. Could be mistaken for a larva, but these adult females glow. And so the males are flying around close to the ground, close to the vegetation with these huge eyes, trying to find these somewhat dim lights that the females produce. The third type of firefly that we have are the daytime dark fireflies. And so as the name suggests, they are active during the daytime and they actually don't produce light. They generally don't have lanterns, or if they do, they're extremely reduced and don't seem to be used. And we know for some species and suspect for many others that they're actually using pheromones to communicate. So even though these species don't light up, they're still part of the Lempirid family of fireflies. And so we still include them in our program work. Next slide. I'm going to just touch briefly on the firefly life cycle. And I know this graphic is a little overwhelming. There's a lot of details in here, but basically the message I want you to get from this is that each type of firefly has a slightly different life cycle that it kind of is engaged in. But overall, there are 4 life stages that all fireflies go through: eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. And so each of these can take several weeks to several months. And something I really want to point out here is that the longest life stage of a firefly is the larval stage. So whereas the adults may only be active for 2 to 4 weeks. Again, this is what we think of when we think of fireflies typically, is this adult active period. That's a really short period of their life cycle. The larvae could live up to 2 years or more. So when we think about conservation actions and management actions and ways to help fireflies, I'm going to bring this up again later, but really thinking beyond just the adult life stage, but also the larval stage where they're always out there. They could be impacted by all of the different activities that we're doing on the ground. And something else I want to mention too, I talked about how the day active species do not produce light, but as juveniles, all fireflies do produce light that we're aware of so far. And so the eggs can glow, the larvae can glow, the pupae can glow, but not all adults do. Next slide. So what do fireflies eat? Fireflies are predators. This is in the larval stage, up to 2 years of feasting on soft-bodied invertebrates. They typically go after things like snails, slugs, and worms. And once they find their prey, they actually inject them with this numbing chemical, and then they are able to eat their prey. And some species seem to be really specific on particular prey items, such as like certain snail species, and others seem to be more generalist. There's a lot that we're still learning about firefly diets and whether each species is a specialist or a generalist. But can you imagine you're in this snail shell, living your snail life, and all of a sudden this firefly larva comes at you with these huge mandibles, injecting these toxins? It seems like a terrible way to go, but that's nature for you. So the adults of many species actually do not eat. And again, like all of nature, there are exceptions to this. There's a group of fireflies known as Futurus fireflies, and the females are predatory, the adult females. And so they will actually mimic the flash patterns of other firefly species just to kind of lure in males and then eat those males. And they do this because they lack the protective toxins that other fireflies have. And so by eating fireflies that do have those toxins, they're able to basically, ingest them and then pass them on to their young. There are also some observations of fireflies mouthing or maybe even eating sap, flower nectar, and things of that sort, but those observations aren't super common. So where are fireflies found? There are over 2,200, I think we're actually up to like 2,400 species described across the world. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. And here in the US and Canada, we have 174 currently described species and 2 subspecies. And more species are being found and described every year. Even just in the last couple of years, we've had, I think, 5 or 6 new species described. Something that a lot of people tend to be shocked by is that we actually have fireflies in every state except Hawaii. And this is true not just for the daytime species and the glowworms, but also flashing species. So we do have flashing fireflies in the West, as some of you have seen. But a lot of folks are really surprised by that. There's this kind of myth that flashing fireflies are only found east of the Rockies, but it's not true. They're not as common out west, and they tend to be in more isolated populations, but they are definitely here. So that was just a very brief overview of fireflies generally, and so I'm going to kind of shift gears now and talk about the Southwest spring firefly, Biologica wickershamorum. And we being those of us working with Biologica wickershamorum, we tend to call them BWs, which is a much easier way of referring to them. So I might do that in the presentation, and that I'm referring still to the Southwest spring firefly. So just to give a brief overview of this species, you can see a picture of it here by Scott Silwick. The Southwest spring firefly is one of 2 known flashing species in southern Arizona. We suspect there might be a 3rd species as well, but we are still working to find additional populations of that species. But this is the firefly in southern Arizona that is active right now. They're usually active from June through late July, and typically before the summer monsoons begin. Although you all have already been getting monsoon rains and they're still active. I was just down there last week with Rachel doing surveys for this species. This species is nice for me in particular as a researcher, and I think for others who are just interested in fireflies, because it's active earlier in the evening. It will actually come out a little bit before sunset, and then it's active for about an hour after sunset. So it has a really short flash time. It's easy if you get to a site a little bit late, you might miss the show entirely. I had some sites last week where the adults were active for just half an hour and then they were done. So it can be really short, really quick time. The flash pattern for this species is a single green flash about every 1.5 seconds. And this is important because every flashing firefly species has a species-specific flash pattern. And so we use that in addition to things like morphological traits and activity period and location to come up with an ID for the species. And this is more applicable out east, but there are some groups of fireflies like the foothills that I mentioned where all the individuals in hand might look exactly the same. And that can be really tricky when you're trying to ID species in the field. And so using things like flash pattern can help. Of course, with foothills and the females mimicking other flash patterns of other species, that can make it tricky as well. But as far as we know so far, folks in Arizona do not need to worry about that, which is kind of nice. The distribution of this firefly, like I said, is in primarily southern Arizona. Last year, there was the first documented population in New Mexico, just across the border. So it's now known from 2 states. And it seems to be so far limited to 2 ecoregions, the Madre and Sky Islands, and then also the Arizona, New Mexico mountains. And so this species, there's actually 2 subspecies. There's the nominate subspecies, and then there's Biologica wickershamorum piscium, and that's the one that's found more in the Arizona, New Mexico mountains, a little bit further north of the other, the nominate subspecies. One reason that we are really interested in this firefly is that a group of us did IUCN, which is International Union for Conservation of Nature, red list assessments, where we basically were attempting to assess extinction risk for a whole group of fireflies. We ended up doing 132 species for the US and Canada, trying to determine what species were most at risk of extinction. And this was one of the species. We categorized it as vulnerable, and we're really worried about it. I'll talk a little bit about the threats that it faces in a minute, but it's actually currently under review for ESA listing, which Rachel is going to talk about a little bit later. We put in a petition last year just because we're worried about the survival of this species. So let's say you want to go look for BWs and you want to know how to ID them. In addition to that flash pattern that I mentioned, there are some morphological traits that you can look for. So this species was actually described by Dr. Joe Cicero in 1983, and I believe he is on this call as well, so maybe he'll help us out with some questions later. But there are some specific morphological features that you can use to help ID this species. And all these pictures you see here are of the BW firefly. So again, looking at that head shield that I mentioned earlier, and it's maybe a little bit difficult to see, maybe the top left is easier, but the corners of the head shield where it touches the rest of the body, those happen to be quite angled compared to other species, especially to the one other species, Photinus nulli, that you would see in southern Arizona. So that's a really good feature to look for. Also the size, they range in size from about 9 to a little over 10 millimeters in length. The wing covers, so the rest of the body you see is darkened. These are hardened wing covers that are typical of beetles. And in many populations, they are margined in yellow. And so you can kind of see that on here. There are exceptions to this. So the Pisceum subspecies described by Joe that's found further north, those tend to be, or they are all completely dark. They do not have the yellow margins. We have been finding some individuals in the other BW, the nominate subspecies populations that actually don't have this yellow marking either. So there is a bit of variation in the populations themselves. But definitely, looking at the size, looking at the flash pattern, looking at these really angled corners of the head shield. And then if you want to start getting really down into the details, you can also look at the claws of the males. And the bottom right-hand photo, I tried to zoom way in, but hopefully you can see, but on those claws, they're actually cleft or split in the males. And this is a diagnostic feature for Bicelonica. The females have simple claws, so you won't be able to see it on theirs, but that is a good feature to look for. And to date, this particular species of Bicelonica is the only one that has been documented from the US. There are quite a few more species as you head south into Mexico and Central America. You go back actually, thanks. So Photinus nulli, which I mentioned is the primary other flashing species you might encounter, it has a similar range, and we know of at least one location in Arizona where they both occur. But it is smaller, it's slimmer, and it's usually active later in the season. So the Photinus nulli, which is the synchronous southwest firefly, that one tends to be active late at night, like usually 9:30, 10, once it's fully dark. And then after the summer monsoons have started. So it can run from July through August with its activity period. So I just wanted to point out some differences as well between the males and females. So on the left, you can see that the female is on the left. She's larger than the male, which is on the right. But overall, they have those yellow wing margins, the sharply angled head shield corners, kind of typical BW look. Another diagnostic feature, which I didn't really mention, was on the head shield. You see this black stripe, and that is often used for species ID as well. The shape of it, how far it reaches to the edge, things like that. On the right-hand side over here, where they're flipped over, so the male is now on the left. And I just want to point out the difference in the lanterns. So those kind of whitish yellow segments at the bottom of the body, those are the lanterns. That's where the light is produced. That's what you see when they're flashing. So males have much larger lanterns than the females. You'll see there are 2 whole segments that are fully filled. Whereas the female just has a much smaller lantern. It's just that little white section inside one of the segments. And so this is true across many firefly species, that a lot of species will actually have differences in the male and female lanterns. And that can be used to help determine the sex of the species you're looking at. Next slide, thanks. So here is a map of the species distribution, which is actually a little bit outdated now because we've been finding so many new populations in Arizona this year. But like I said, it was previously only known from Arizona, and now we know that it also occurs in New Mexico. And basically the way this map works is that anything in blue are the counties where we have found the Pisceum subspecies. And then you can see hopefully the blue dots, which are the actual places. So up until I think it was last year, we only knew of one location for Pisceum. And now we've got a bunch of folks looking with the Forest Service and others who have started mapping out new populations. So that has been really incredible to see, more populations coming out because we were worried about it only occurring in one place. And then for the rosy colored red counties further south, those are all the counties where the nominate subspecies has been found. And so you'll see lots of red dots. And we have quite a few more from this year. Now we had over 35 sites last year, and so we'd have definitely more to add this year. We're over 40 now. And I think this is really neat because when Joe first described the species, he worked on the species quite a bit in the 80s, and then, eventually moved to Florida and was pursuing other education there. And so the species, I think, was largely overlooked until the early 2020s when a researcher named Cheryl Molihan found Joe's report and started getting excited about fireflies and started going out looking for this species. And she revisited sites Joe had been to and then also started finding new sites. And so Cheryl, working with Joe, who's now back in Arizona, has really kind of catapulted us into knowing a lot more about this species and its habitat associations and its distribution. Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to touch briefly on some other efforts that we have been engaging in to detect fireflies and predict their distribution. A big kind of data gap that we have found in our species status assessments was that we really weren't even sure about like the full extent of the species range and where it was distributed throughout that range. So a lot of effort has been going towards actually finding additional populations. So I'm going to start here on the right with this map of the Muleshoe Ranch and then talking a bit about the wet-dry data and species distribution models. So Cheryl and Rhonda, who's pictured over here to the left, and I and several others worked with a Tufts University graduate several years ago to build some species distribution models based on the data we already had for BW and try to determine, what other areas might it be occurring in? Can we use these models to help with survey planning, especially because there's such a short period of the year in which we can actually do surveys and there's only so many of us who can go out each night. And so the models were, predicting all of these different places where we might go, but then we were able to get some wet, dry stream data from the Nature Conservancy and from the BLM and some other folks, which is, I'm guessing a lot of you already know about this, but it was new for me, where it's basically surveys of streams in the driest month of the year, so in June, and basically documenting what stretches have water and which stretches do not. And when we fed this into the model, we basically found that every site that had perennial water, so it had water in June, actually had BW, which was really awesome to find out. So Cheryl and Ron, here's a map of a bunch of the places they went, and all of the green dots in this map are sites where they went looking for fireflies and they found fireflies. So these were all newly documented sites in the Muleshoe. So kind of building off of that, and when I mentioned this issue of there's only so few of us and it's such a short period of time, and we're trying to get more volunteers out to look for fireflies, but some sites are really remote, they're difficult to get to. We're working at night, which just adds to the complications. And so Cheryl and Ron have been piloting this cool project where they're basically putting out modified trail cameras. You can kind of see one on the tree there. But they are setting them out during the day, letting them run the entire season, and then coming back and collecting them. And then they can actually run through the footage and see whether or not flashes have been recorded. And I got to see some of their footage last week, and it's actually working. Like, they are able to detect firefly flashes at all of these sites. And the nice thing is that, you know, there's 2 of them and they can only go typically to 1 site per night. But now with these modified trail cameras acting as additional eyes, they could have 10, 15, 20 sites being covered in a given night. Next slide. Thanks. So just to talk a bit about the habitat that this firefly uses, we're still kind of learning more and more about where it can be found, and really trying to understand the habitat associations of the species and even just the different environmental variables and habitat features, which Rachel's going to talk about a bit in her own research that she's been doing. But these are just some images of places where we've actually seen this firefly. So the one on the left and middle, that's where we found Bisolonica wickershamorum, the nominate subspecies. And then to the far right is the initial site where Pisceum was found. So a little bit different. That one's more of a seep heading into a creek. But we've found them in seeps, in springs, in marshy areas, around old cattle ponds. The primary thing really seems to be that this species requires perennial water. So in places where you have perennial water, particularly if there's some kind of marshy situation or a seep, that seems to be important for the species. And so we are really excited to be working with SIA and chatting with you all today, because we're hoping that there might be some overlap with the Spring Seeker program. And, you know, a lot of you are doing really incredible work mapping out springs in Southern Arizona and beyond. And we think there might be some potential for some of those sites to actually be sites where BW might be found, similar to using this wet dry stream data and the efforts of those volunteers. Next slide. So what are the threats to the Southwest spring firefly? These are primarily drought, habitat loss, and light pollution, which is true for a lot of firefly species. Fireflies and their prey need moisture to survive. They dry out easily. Habitat loss and degradation, especially in Southern Arizona, is primarily from things like agriculture, mining, cattle grazing, any kind of modification of waterways. These can all really destroy fragile habitats used by this species. And then again, just talking about those really species-specific flash patterns, like the fireflies need to be able to communicate that way in order to find each other, in order to mate. And so if there's a lot of artificial light in the area where they occur, it can kind of wash out those signals. It can change their behaviors and lead to negative reproductive results as a result of that. All right, so knowledge gaps. Like I said, the one that we've really been focusing on recently is just the range and distribution of this species. We are also interested in learning more about population sizes and trends, natural history, which Rachel is starting to do more work on, and then really a better understanding of how these specific threats are impacting this particular firefly and how different management actions might help or harm it. Next slide. So I think I'm out of time, so I'm gonna really quickly run through a couple of slides of looking for the Southwest spring firefly and how you all might help us. So next slide. So Xerces and partners launched a program called Firefly Atlas last year, and it's really this collaborative effort to track and document threatened and data deficient fireflies across North America, so both US and Canada. Next. And this website is both a data portal and a series of training resources to go out and do your own surveys for fireflies across the country. But it's also meant to be an educational resource. We have a species checklist where you can actually go in and filter by state or by species name. And it's kind of nice. You can get a checklist for your state and see how many fireflies occur there, what type of firefly they are, whether they flash or glow. So it's a nice resource that I use a lot. Next slide. It talks about several focal species and focal regions. So this is based on those assessments that we did, and we really highlight some of the species that are of conservation concern, but that we also feel confident people can go out, look for, find, and ID via photos. So we do ask that people submit photos with their observations. And then they all get plotted onto a map like you see to the right here. And the focal regions are that red polygon that you see. And already, we have observations out of the side of those polygons. So that's where we initially thought the species would occur, and that was kind of our focal space. But now we're realizing that they're beyond those as well. So we need to update that soon. We have data sheets for surveys that you can download. These match a online portal where you would then upload the data at the end of your survey, and you can either do a complete survey with these data sheets, or if you just happen to see a firefly and you capture some basic information about it, you can also submit that as an incidental observation. And both are helpful. The nice thing about surveys is that you actually are, even if you don't see fireflies, you would still report that, and so we would be collecting negative data as well. Next slide. Yeah, this is just an example of our data sheet. And yes, please report everything you find or don't find. Negative data is helpful as well. And then we just have a few other resources on the website if you want to learn more about this species. We have a fact sheet, we have a rare species poster, and then this incredible guide to fireflies of the Southwest, which I highly recommend. It was written by Anna Walker with the New Mexico Biopark Society, one of our partners, and she just did a really incredible job pulling together a ton of information about Southwest fireflies for BW, but as many other species as well. And then just a plug for the Xerces website, we have a bunch of other firefly resources as well. Everything from tourism to site guidelines for managers to firefly-friendly lighting practices. And with that, I just want to say thanks to all of our supporters, especially the Band Foundation, who fund all of our firefly work, and to all of our Xerces members who donate and become members of Xerces. And I just want to say thanks to Sarah and Rick and Rachel, and I'm going to let Rachel take over from here.
All right, thanks, Candace. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Endangered Species Act listing process. So I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I work on the Species Assessment Team, which is a national team that works to assess species for listing under the ESA. And the Fish and Wildlife Service's mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. We have over 8,000 employees across the country, including in territories such as Guam, and we work with species both within and outside the U.S. The service has a wide variety of programs, including our Endangered Species Program, which is called Ecological Services, and that's where I work. But we also have our national wildlife refuges, of which there are over 560 across the country. We have fish and aquatic conservation programs, which include 70 national fish hatcheries. We also have migratory bird programs, habitat restoration programs, law enforcement, and more. So one of the most important roles of the service is in implementing the Endangered Species Act, which we commonly refer to as the ESA. And the ESA establishes protections for fish, wildlife, and plants, which are on the list of threatened and endangered species, which we refer to as listed. Currently, there are over 2,000 species that are listed or have been proposed for listing. And a lot of people are familiar with the work we do on common wildlife species like black-footed ferret or northern spotted owl or Mexican spotted owl or the Mexican gray wolf, but we also work with invertebrates such as spring snails, vernal pool fairy shrimp, and other invertebrates such as insects. So I just want to briefly cover some of the definitions in the ESA. There tends to be a lot of confusion with what these terms actually mean as they relate to the Endangered Species Act. So an endangered species is one that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And this does not mean that the species will go extinct, just that it has a risk of extinction. And a threatened species is one that is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future. The difference here is that an endangered species is in danger of extinction now, and a threatened species is likely to become at risk of extinction in the future. So threatened does not mean just a little bit less in peril than endangered. It's all about the timing of that risk of extinction. And for this reason, when we're assessing for listing, it's important for us to look both at how the species is doing currently and how it will be doing under some future scenarios. Generally speaking, in implementing the Endangered Species Act, our goal is to get the right conservation to the right species. To do that, we have to identify the species that need the protections of the Act and the level of protection that they need, and also get the conservation to those species while limiting threats that are putting the species in peril. We also want to avoid providing protections to species that do not need protections. Listing species that don't need protections takes critical and extremely limited conservation funds away from those species that are in desperate need. So although we care about all species, not all species need the protections of the Endangered Species Act. So how do we determine if a species warrants listing under the ESA? We start by assessing and organizing all of the available information on a species that is pertinent to its risk of extinction. We are required to use the best available data. We cannot ask for new data to be collected, and we usually don't have time to wait for new information. We cannot delay our decisions until better information becomes available. We are required to use what is available at the time. And since many of our species are rare and data are not readily available, we often must make our decisions upon limited information. So to help us organize and understand the available information on what a species needs to survive, what the threats are, what the current condition of the species is, and how we expect that species to fare in the future, we have adopted a framework called the Species Status Assessment Framework. This is a biologically based assessment that we use to inform our ESA listing decisions. An SSA will not determine the status of the species, but it will provide the available information to decision makers so that they can make an informed listing decision. The three major components for an SSA are the species needs, the current condition, and future condition. It's important to note that an SSA will produce a report, but the SSA process is more than just the report. It's the analysis of the available information on the viability of a species. So what does viability mean? It means the ability of a species to sustain populations in the wild over time. And in the SSA, we use the conservation biology principles of resiliency, redundancy, and representation to characterize that viability. We refer to these as the 3 Rs. So resiliency is the ability of a species to withstand natural variation or stochasticity. Redundancy is the ability of the species to withstand catastrophes. And representation is the ability of a species to adapt to changing conditions. And I'm going to cover each of these in turn. So resiliency is the ability of a species to withstand normal year-to-year variation in environmental conditions. So in things like rainfall or temperature, also to withstand normal periodic disturbances such as fire or floods, and to withstand normal variation in demographic rates such as mortality and reproduction. So these photos illustrate the concept of ecological resilience. On the left, we have a forest that was too dense, which resulted in a high-intensity fire that killed the trees and damaged the soils, completely changing the landscape. And on the right, the trees were sparser prior to fire, which resulted in a low-intensity fire that moved along the ground, leaving the rest of the system intact. So we would say that the system on the right is resilient to fire, and the system on the left is not. In SSAs, we evaluate resiliency at the population level by examining factors such as abundance, survival, reproduction, connectivity with other populations, and the quality of the habitat that's available. And we try to determine whether each population can withstand that normal variation year to year that we would expect to occur there. Redundancy is the ability to withstand catastrophes that would be expected to wipe out an entire population. Therefore, we would need other populations that are large enough and spread over a large enough area that not all the populations would be lost in a single catastrophic event. So you can think of these events as things like hurricanes, severe storms, droughts, drying of perennial waters, and we can gauge redundancy by analyzing the number and distribution of populations. So in this example, the circles represent populations. Species A has higher redundancy than species B because it has a greater number and distribution of populations. Representation is the ability of the species to adapt both to near-term and long-term changes in its physical and biological environment. So this is things like changing climate conditions, changes in the habitat structure, new pathogens or new predators showing up on the scene. And we gauge this by looking at genetic, phenotypic, which is how genetic traits are expressed, and ecological diversity. So in this example, the species on the left has representation in the form of 2 different color morphologies and also has ecological diversity in the habitats in which it occupies, while the species on the right is limited to only 1 color and 1 habitat type. So the species on the left will be more readily able to adapt to changes in environmental conditions. For instance, if any one of the habitats becomes more prevalent, it will be able to persist, whereas species B may only be able to persist if its single habitat type persists. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the different components of a species status assessment. So we first look at what the species needs are, and we look at the individual population and species level. So individual level needs might include things like specific ranges of water temperatures for fish to spawn, or clean cobble for fish eggs to develop, or a specific soil type for a plant to grow within specific shading requirements. Population level needs may include the number, distribution, and connectivity of populations or demographic characteristics such as population growth rates. And then at the species level, needs could include things like adequate representation and redundancy to withstand changing conditions and catastrophic events. Next, we identify threats to the species, and these can include things like urbanization, climate change, agriculture, or groundwater pumping. And we also have to determine what the species' response to those threats may be. So then, given what we know about the species, where it occurs, what it needs, and the threats to the species, we can assess the current condition of the species as a whole. So we look at the 3 R's and ask ourselves, are there enough populations in good enough condition, with enough diversity and in enough places that we expect the species to persist? And this can help to inform our decision of whether or not the species is currently at risk of extinction or endangered. We then project how the species will be doing in the future. When we assess future conditions, we develop a range of plausible future scenarios, which can include factors that we are able to project and also are likely to influence species condition. And we try to capture at a minimum a best case scenario and worst case scenario, but we do not include pie in the sky scenarios or anything that's not plausible. So we wouldn't include like a doomsday scenario, like, well, a meteor might hit the earth and kill all of the populations. We would look at only things that we can project in the future and that we know will impact the species, things like climate change. So you can see on the right here, that came from the Cactus fruginus pygmaeal SSA that I worked on. And we had 3 different scenarios, and we looked at both climate change and habitat loss and fragmentation under each of those. So then looking at this range of plausible future conditions, we ask, in the foreseeable future, will there be enough populations in good enough condition with enough diversity and in enough places that we expect the species to persist? That is the species likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future or threatened? So once we know the life history, the distribution, threats, current condition, and future condition, we can make our decision of whether or not the species needs for the protections of the ESA. And given that all species are at some risk of extinction over some time period, we are tasked with determining if the risk of extinction to the species is high enough that the species is in danger of extinction currently or in the near term. If not, then we ask, is the risk of extinction high enough in the foreseeable future such that the species is likely to become endangered or at risk of extinction? Ultimately, the decision of whether or not to list the species is a policy decision, but it is based on the best available scientific information that isn't contained within the SSA. So this brings me to the Southwest spring firefly. As Candace mentioned, this species was petitioned for listing last year, and this past January, the service published our finding that the petition contained substantial information indicating that listing may be warranted. So this does not mean that the species is listed. It means that we are going to be assessing it for listing. So our next step is to begin developing an SSA for the species, and that document will inform our decision of whether or not the species warrants listing. And we plan to publish that listing decision in 2028. So as Candace talked about earlier, there's very limited information on the species on which to base a listing decision. There is no published information beyond Joe's initial description of the species, describing the species ecology or habitat needs. We have no information on the population size or the full distribution of the species. So we also lack data from Sonora, Mexico. We do have one record from Sonora, but that's all we know. We don't have any information on other potential populations or their habitats in Mexico. We don't have a clear picture of the ecological or genetic diversity of the species. As Candace mentioned, we're still finding new populations in new areas every summer. So these data gaps make assessing the resiliency, redundancy, and representation of the species extremely difficult. So obviously in my day job, I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but I am also pursuing my PhD at the University of Arizona. And with my dissertation research, I hope to gather some basic information on the ecology of the species, its habitat needs, population sizes, temporal variability, and the distribution to start filling in some of these gaps. However, given the short activity period for the species, both within the season and each night, serving a large number of populations is impossible for one person. So this is where you all can come in. By volunteering to survey for the species, you are collecting critical data that can help inform the upcoming species status assessment and our listing decision. So by gaining a clearer understanding of what the species needs, the current distribution, and the condition of the populations, we will be more able to provide the right level of protections to this species and project how the species might be doing into the future. So the ultimate goal of listing a species under the Endangered Species Act is to prevent extinctions. And our next highest priority is to recover the species so that it no longer needs the protections of the Endangered Species Act. When a species is listed, we write a recovery plan, which identifies priorities for the species conservation and what it would take to recover the species. Listing also provides protections from take, which means to harass, harm, pursue, capture, or collect, or attempt to do any of those things. Although sometimes those actions can be allowed under specific conditions or with an appropriate permit. We would also designate critical habitat, which would help us identify the most important places for the species. And this would provide protections for any project that has a federal nexus. So that's projects that are authorized, funded, or carried out by a federal agency. They would need to consult with us for any of those projects to ensure that they're not adversely impacting the species. And listing also gives us the ability to work with Mexico if that's what's needed for recovery of the species. So in summary, listing a species gives us some really great tools to help recover a species and prevent extinctions. But again, it's critical that we use these tools only for species that need them the most. You can help ensure that we make the best decision possible by helping us gather more information about this amazing species. And with that, if we have time, we can get into questions.
Fantastic. Rachel and Candace, that was amazing. I learned more about fireflies than I have ever known in my entire life. So thank you very much for that. We do have some questions that popped up in the chat somewhere about identification, and maybe that's covered more in the guide that you shared. But we have some questions about how do you differentiate between an adult female glowworm and a larva? Because they, I guess, look fairly similar based on Candace's overview.
Yeah, I actually realized as I was talking, I was like, wait, this is actually a larva, not an adult. I think Joe would probably be the best to answer that question, but yeah, the females they're sometimes referred to as larva form, which I think Joe does not like that term, but they don't look like a regular adult firefly. They don't have the wings, or they'll have like very reduced wings that look like little nubs. and they will have a lantern as well on the tip of their abdomen.
Very cool. Okay. And then kind of related to in the identification space, someone asked whether they've been seeing the third type of firefly, that daytime dark type, all over Tucson lately. Like, is this a common time of year to see a lot of them? Or yeah, can you just talk a little bit more about that third kind?
Yeah, there are several daytime dark species in southern Arizona, and so you could definitely be seeing one of those. Yeah, there's for the Firefly Atlas, we have 3 kind of focal species, one of which is one of the daytime dark fireflies, but it's only been seen in like one main area that essentially is extirpated now. But yeah, definitely they're out, spring through summer, and you could definitely be seeing one of those.
Very cool. That actually relates to another question that we got about documentation of species in general. Based on your overview in the Firefly Atlas, are you interested in documentation for many different types of species or just the BW, or like, yeah, what are the, I think you covered some of that, but maybe just kind of give another little overview of that.
Yeah, we would love to have any observations or survey data for any species of firefly. And like I said, our program is just for the US and Canada. Unfortunately, we're hoping to expand it to Mexico eventually once we can get more materials translated. But yeah, any species, we have the focal species just to help kind of direct efforts. But we welcome any records. We do try to go through and verify records based on like photos and other data that people submit. But like I was saying, a lot of species, it's really difficult to do that. So we may not be able to verify, especially for those of you in the East, if it's like a Photurus firefly, it might just be too tricky, but we can get to genus usually. But yeah, we'd love to have any and all records. We have so many data deficient species. Over half the species we assessed were data deficient. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So another question we just got about identifications. Since the females have lanterns that are half the size of males, can experts differentiate in the field by the intensity of the light? Or do you have to have them in hand? I guess is the question.
Yeah, so I'd say the big thing that we use for differentiating is that the males are typically flying around looking for females, whereas the females tend to be pretty stationary. So they'll be on the ground or perched on some vegetation or a rock. And typically the males are the ones, when we talk about these like species specific flash patterns, it's the males that are creating those, producing those. And then the females, a lot of times their response flash may just be like a single flash or like a couple flashes to the male. And so it can be tricky if the temperatures aren't very high, because sometimes the males will also perch and they won't give like their usual flash pattern. But yeah, typically males are flying around, they're giving that specific flash pattern, and the females are just kind of perched somewhere with and not giving a very complicated flash pattern in return.
Very cool. Thank you. Okay, we also have a couple of questions about kind of more generally data and all that. And so specifically, have any fireflies been documented in the Phoenix area? And then what's the link between INAT and the Firefly Atlas?
Yeah, so fireflies have been ID'd around the Phoenix area, not necessarily flashing fireflies, but others. And INAT is a really great tool for looking to see, like you can just filter to Lampurity or fireflies, and then just Arizona or Phoenix or whatever area you want to look at, just to get a really broad sense of what is being seen where. INAT is nice too because you can filter by year if you just want to see what's been reported that year or that month. I use it a lot. When we were building the Firefly Atlas, we were like, should we just use INAT instead of building a whole new program? Because INAT's so amazing. It has a lot of funding behind it. A lot of people know how to use it. But in the end, because INAT doesn't collect flash pattern data, there are so many species that we just can't ID because we really need, that's a critical piece of information for a lot of species. And so by creating Firefly Atlas, we can collect that data, and we can also get information on any like site threats or, habitat information, which is often lost on INAT. And we can also capture that negative survey data that I mentioned. So it's like, we went to the spot, we were there at the right time of year, the right time of night, the right conditions, and yet we didn't see them. And not to say that they're not there, but that gives us more information than we would otherwise. We have a map on the Firefly Atlas website that shows any observation that's been submitted through the Atlas, but it also is now pulling data from GBIF, which is a big aggregator of biological data, and it includes INAT records that are research grade. And so if you look at our map now, you'll be able to see all of the research grade INAT observations as well. And hopefully that'll be helpful to get a sense of what's being seen where and kind of focus in that way.
Very cool. So this now, I'm going to transition a little bit towards other things that we can do to help as a group of volunteers. We have a lot of folks who have trail cameras out for our photofauna program. And you mentioned that there was a modification that was done for those. Are there any things that we can have, regular users do that they could also be contributing to the Firefly documentation through trail cameras, or is it something more specific for that modification?
Yeah, the main modification for that is really removing the flash that it produces at night. So usually if like wildlife walks by, it flashes and takes a photo, right? Like you want to be able to see this creature in the dark. But with fireflies, you don't want that flash to happen because it washes out the flash of the fireflies. And so by disconnecting that flash, you're basically able to capture the actual flash of the firefly. And so, yeah, Cheryl Mullihan, she has kind of a protocol document written up, and I know Rachel's doing this for some of her sites as well, but we can share that if folks want to modify their cameras. It's been a pretty neat tool to see okay, we know fireflies are here, and now we can actually send people back to, confirm what species they are.
Yeah, I'll just add with that, with the cameras, they have to have the ability to do a time lapse. So obviously fireflies aren't big enough to trigger the motion sensor on a trail camera. So we've been programming them to start taking photos around 7 p.m., take photos every 10 seconds until 10 p.m. for the species of firefly in particular. If they wanted to photograph the Southwest synchronous firefly, you'd probably want to program it a little bit later. But we're using cameras that can do that, and not all trail cameras have the ability to do time lapse.
Yeah, and I will just add that you then have thousands upon thousands of photos that you have to go through afterwards. And Cheryl is working with a researcher who's trying to put together a program that can basically analyze
automate it.
Yeah, automate it. But at the moment, they're just physically going through tens of thousands of photos. And so, maybe some of you, that sounds exciting.
I will say we have some pretty dedicated volunteers who actually every week go to the office and look through thousands and thousands of camera photos.
Okay.
So we can work on that. Awesome. Okay, we only have a minute left, but I would like to ask kind of a bigger question of what is the number one thing that I or anyone can do to support local firefly populations?
Well, the number one thing, that's tricky.
Maybe it's too much to do in a minute.
I will say the big things that I usually recommend are, think about light pollution as much as you can. Not use lights outside at night, turn off your lights, use motion sensors, timers. Don't use pesticides, especially insecticides for beetles, those will kill fireflies. And then if you do have a yard or a garden, just letting some parts of it go wild. Like I was saying, the larvae are there for up to 2 years. And so really trying to avoid ground disturbance, trying to think like a firefly and think about the places they might want to be hanging out or hunting or, talking to potential mates. But those are the big things for sure. And maybe Rachel has some as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the conservation goes, helping us to gather more information is really important. The more we know about what the species needs, the more we can do to protect those features in the habitat. So.
Wonderful. Well, Rachel and Candace, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I will look forward to seeing the recording again so that I can learn some more of this information. And I thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our guests who joined us this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks.